Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance Report. First, have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? You wanted to talk about something in the compliance or compliance-related field, but really had no idea how to get started? Take a listen from our sponsor, One Stone Creative.
If you are enjoying this show, you might enjoy hosting your own. As an expert in your field, you have skills, knowledge, and insight that can help you expand your practice, meet new people, and create amazing content to share with the world. In as little as 2 hours a week, you can dramatically change how you promote, fill, and position your business. And One Stone Creative can show you how. Learn more at onestonecreative.net.
Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. Today I have back with me fan favorite Michael Volkov. Mike and I take a deep dive into the Fresenius FCPA enforcement action. We take a look at the background facts. We take a look at the bribery scheme. We take a look at the investigative and remediation steps that the company took. We consider how it obtained the frankly stunning result of a non-prosecution agreement and even a 40% discount off the low end of the range under the U.S. sentencing guidelines. It's a fascinating exploration of one of the most eagerly awaited and significant FCPA enforcement actions in 2019. Finally, the FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. This is Tom Fox back with Mike Volkov for another episode. We're going to break down the Fresenius FCPA settlement for you. Mike, first of all, welcome.
Well, thanks, Tom. Happy Monday to you.
So, Mike, last week we had another major FCPA case that's been in the wings and wind for quite some time, the Fresenius case. You want to start off by giving the background on it?
Yeah, we saw Fresenius Medical, which is the largest supplier of dialysis equipment and services, agreed to pay $231 million to the Justice Department and the SEC, and they resolved FCPA violations in 17 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Interestingly, Fresenius came up with DOJ, came up with a non-prosecution agreement. They agreed to pay $87 million and the reappearance of another corporate monitorship, this for a 2-year period. And then a third year, they have a self-reporting requirement. Then in the SEC enforcement action, again by administrative order, Fresenius agreed to disgorge $147 million or so, and to disgorge all of that. So according to the settlement, Fresenius paid approximately $30 million in bribes over a 10-year period in a number of countries, a lot of West African countries, which I'm not going to go through all of those, but also including China, Mexico, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Serbia, Spain, and Turkey. And they earned approximately $140 million from its corrupt bribery payments. Quickly going through the FCPA corporate enforcement policy factors, they got credit for voluntary disclosure because it was disclosed in a timely fashion. Partial credit for cooperation. They had a very thorough internal investigation. They made factual presentations. They reported on witness interviews, produced documents, translated the documents, complied with foreign data privacy laws, but they didn't get full cooperation credit because they did not timely respond to requests by DOJ, and at times they did not provide, this is the language, fulsome responses to requests for information. They also implemented remedial measures, including removal of 10 employees who were involved in the misconduct, some of whom were at the senior level. They enhanced their compliance program, controls, and anti-corruption training. They terminated business relationships with third-party agents and distributors who participated in the misconduct, and they put in a sort of new third-party due diligence program. And one factor the DOJ noted was that some misconduct in, I think, one of the countries continued to occur until 2016, and that's why that appears to be one of the primary reasons for the appointment of the monitor. So after weighing all of these factors, They came out, I thought, Tom, pretty well with a non-prosecution agreement from DOJ, and then they got a 40% discount from the bottom of the U.S. sentencing guideline range. And then they received credit for the SEC payment of $147 million in disgorgement. So overall, I thought it was, given the breadth of the conduct, the length of it, the number of countries involved, and for how long it went on, I thought Fresenius did pretty well in the end here with the settlement. What did you think?
So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Mike. They did very well. I guess one of the things I wanted to explore with you on this podcast is this is now a series, one of a series of cases we have seen since the implementation of the FCPA corporate enforcement policy are announced by Rod Rosenstein in November 2017. And is this really where we're going to be going in the future in terms of a lighter touch on the charging documents and perhaps greater credit given for cooperation, remediation, self-disclosure, even if it's not full and as extensive and robust enough to merit a declination? So perhaps we can hold those questions until the end. I thought Fresenius did very well in achieving the NPA, but I was also struck, Mike, by the amount of detail in both the non-prosecution agreement and the SEC cease and desist order that is extraordinarily useful for the compliance professional in terms of the bribery schemes. Because in addition to sort of the standard, let's just pay on a sham consulting contract or through a third party surreptitiously, we had some pretty interesting bribery schemes here that people were clearly going out of their way to create a structure that would be hidden from the corporate office and perhaps even the compliance function to hide the money. So in our best Watergate fashion, perhaps we can follow the money in some of these.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think for the compliance practitioner, looking at each country and the statement of facts provides kind of a checklist of, standard areas that we've seen where there's third-party, funding and bribery schemes. But then your point, Tom, which is there were also, to be candid, some schemes that I've never seen before. And maybe it's worthwhile for compliance people to take a look at the specific facts, and it's in both the DOJ statement of facts and in the SEC's factual presentation as well. So, like one of my favorite countries, because I worked on the Halliburton case, Tom, as you know, is Angola. And for example, in Angola, they used bribery payments to an Angolan military officer and a government-employed nephrologist. And one of the ways, and this is actually very common that I've seen in Angola, is to give equity interests to government officials through joint ventures, or not specifically the government official, but a family member, somebody close. So here they had a joint venture, and there was there was approval by Fresenius's management, but it turned out that they hid the fact that part of the joint venture shares were owned by a government official. But in Fresenius, for example, in Angola, they contracted with the son of a military officer for warehousing space that it never used. To me, Angola and equity interests always go hand in hand to look, and maybe it's from the oil industry days and operating, agreements and things in Angola, but it just seems to me to be a common means by which government officials seek to get money. They hide their equitable interests. So I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of one of my favorite countries, that being Angola. So
you're the only person I've ever heard Angola being one of their favorite countries.
Well, I think, for my days with Halliburton working on that case, and it was a 5-year case, and I got to learn, the ups and downs of the oil industry, and that Angola is obviously known for its oil. But you also mentioned, Tom, that there were there were some other techniques that were used. And like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they were doing, they were cashing employees' checks as a way to fund cash and bribery in a safe, bribery money that was kept in a safe in Saudi Arabia, which is, I've never heard of that before. That was something new. I don't know.
So that was interesting, Mike, because think about the sophistication of that. You have a check being issued to an employee of a local distributor, properly made out at least to that local employee. That local employee cashes it, and that local employee immediately turns that money over to the general manager of the distributor. So much money was generated that literally bags of cash were kept in an office safe, apparently. So that's almost akin to some of the bribery schemes we saw in China with GlaxoSmithKline and Eli Lilly, where you had literally an entire business unit in on the corruption. But in addition to that, there was two others that I specifically wanted to raise up to discuss with you because I thought they were very interesting. In addition to we had charitable donations to a government official's charity. We had fraudulent gifts, travel, and entertainment, but there were two. And the first was a collections racket. And the collections was a standard collection, of outstanding obligations, something that third parties do on a routine basis, something that companies do on a routine basis. And it was so routine that the company had their own collection department within Fresenius, but they subbed out the collection to a third party, and whatever monies apparently were collected through this collection effort, that was used to pay a bribe.
Yeah, that was really interesting because also, Tom, it was, as I recall, there were commissions paid on the collections, and a portion of the commission payments went to like a relative of a government official. I mean, talk about having to dig down in your due diligence, right? You'd have to go sort of 2 to 3 levels down to capture this. But in the healthcare industry, and I would imagine the collections here, because obviously dialysis is a high volume type of business. It's not like each dialysis session is worth, hundreds of thousands. But it's really that was really intriguing to me how creative they got in terms of getting money into the government officials' hands. And I think this was they won certain tenders from the hospital because of this arrangement that they had, which is incredible.
Yeah, there's one other one that intrigued me a little bit as well, and that was payments to customs officials.
Right.
And I raise it for two reasons, Mike. The first was they specifically cited a payment to a customs official of $3,200 to expedite medicine or products across the border. And we've only had one other case where the customs payments were in that range of $3,000. So at first I thought, well, this might be actually an interesting discussion around facilitation payment, because if $3,200 is too much, how far down do you have to go to make a legitimate facilitation payment under the FCPA? But then, as you read further in the non-prosecution agreement, it turned out that they made over $1.7 million in total payments, corrupt payments through the customs, this customs broker and customs to customs officials, and whatever 1.7 million is, it ain't a facilitation payment. So it really speaks to the need to look at your total amount of facilitation payments, because I think probably you and I could come up with at least a plausible argument that $3,200 in an appropriate set of circumstances could be a facilitation payment, but there's no way you can justify north of 1 million total.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing is, you'll see $500 in brokerage fees, okay, in an invoice. And if I presented that to you as a client and said, Tom, does this look reasonable to you? You'd go, yeah. But then on the other hand, if you ever ask me, well, what's the total volume that we're dealing with this person? And it turns out to be $1 million, you'd say, whoa, let's take a second look at that. So that's a good point. There was one, Tom, I wanted to run by you as well, because it kind of, another one that sort of struck me, because it kind of reminded me of, we've been talking about the telecom ventures and the MTS one recently, and the sort of Eastern European or the Uzbekistan schemes. But in Turkey, for example, Fresenius gave a doctor a 35% interest in a joint venture that was worth, they said, $74,000. And then they purchased the shares from the physician, and the physician earned a $356,000 profit. So again, just like, purchasing the interest from a government official, here you have a physician who's clearly a government official. And it's another way to fund a huge amount of bribery. I mean, $356,000 in bribery through what probably looked like, just a normal transaction, purchase transaction. So, look, criminals can be creative. And, I think the whole case itself just gave us a variety of schemes that we've seen, in different contexts, but also what you're pointing out is some other areas that are a little bit different and that we have to watch over, that these are new areas, that people are creative when in terms of trying to get money in people's hands. There are lots of ways that a business can do it if they want to do it.
And to follow up on that point, there's one other bribery scheme utilized that I'd like to raise, and that was one of the schemes used in Spain. In addition to gifts, travel, and entertainment abuse, sham consultancy agreements, there was 3 paragraphs referenced. One, the purchase of a doctor's practice. And it was unclear to me whether these doctors were employees of a state-owned enterprise, but it specifically mentioned the purchase of their practice, and then not simply the purchase, but also that they allowed the doctors to maintain ownership of the building the practice was in, so that Fresenius actually made an additional payment to the doctors for rental space. And it struck me that both of those might look like legitimate business expenses. And certainly if you own a medical practice to prescribe your products in Fresenius, and in a country, and that is not illegal, you might not ever look at to who are you paying rental space for. So it really speaks to the need for a compliance function to be robust and have review of literally everything up and down both the sales chain and the supply chain.
Yeah, I think it also goes to what the volume of transactions for this business is so large that you really have to have kind of a proactive auditing strategy. And I think if you did like transaction testing in these countries and started to, regularly pull transactions and look at the documentation and go down and dig down deeper, some of these may have been caught. And I think it's just a reminder to me on, the need for robust third-party risk management, but really sort of the cutting edge area, I think. And I know on your innovation podcast, you've had some interesting discussions about data analytics and transaction testing and things like that. To me, this is a perfect case where, given the volume that we're talking about, that some of those strategies that you've been discussing with people in terms of proactive monitoring strategies are really critical in an industry like this in particular.
So, Mike, lots for the compliance practitioner to digest in terms of bribery schemes. But now, perhaps we can go to some larger questions. Are there any other points that you thought were important from the compliance practitioner, perhaps from a macro perspective?
Yeah, I always look for guidance on the basic requirement that a chief compliance officer have adequate, independence, adequate resources and authority. And I thought here there was a note early on in describing the facts before they got to the specific countries where DOJ and the FCC both allege that there were inadequate resources devoted to compliance. Given Fresenius's risk profile. And in particular, when noting some of the problems in Saudi Arabia, the government pointed out that there was not a compliance officer located in Saudi Arabia, given the risks. And I think that, as people sort of wrestle with the issue of how to design and implement a global compliance program when you're in a lot of countries, some of which are high risk, that there are circumstances where you really do need to have a local compliance officer with boots on the ground. And you can't rely upon a region or a global office to sort of manage those risks. And I think DOJ, I always am looking for this in terms of tea leaves. And I think that they're getting more and more towards saying to people, you need to have the resources allocated, particularly in the high risk areas. So I thought that was kind of important. And you mentioned early on, Tom, your sort of question about, is this the light touch? And this does seem like a light touch, but it also may reflect that Fresenius, even though they were a little deficient in their cooperation, I suspect they were pretty forthcoming. They had a lot of countries to sort of manage and report on. And it was a global type case that could have been a lot worse. So maybe they did a real good job in terms of, gathering as much information as they could in a timely way.
And then I guess, Mike, the third point was perhaps not directly related to Fresenius, but in terms of both the physical document of the non-prosecution agreement and the Securities and Exchange Commission's cease and desist order, I saw a lot of detail and a lot of information really laid out, both in terms of the law, the facts, jurisdictional arguments, how they were able to hook it all in, and perhaps just greater transparency is the phrase I'm struggling with.
Yeah, no, I think it's been about a year and a half now with this system, with the FCPA corporate enforcement policy, and I feel like we're getting more and more data points, and it's clear that we're going to be living with this framework for a while, and I don't think it's going to change. So, I mean, we're starting to get more certainty, and I don't think it's going to vary that much. I mean, maybe to us it will as practitioners in this area, but I think in general people are going to get more and more reliability as to how to do this.
So any kind of final thoughts on this, Mike, as we wrap up this episode?
Well, I would say this, Tom. I think 2019 so far has been a pretty busy year for FCPA enforcement. We're not like off to a slow start. If anything, we're off to a fast start, and it'll be interesting to see as we head into sort of the second quarter here how things look.
So we had Cognizant Technologies, we had MTS, and now we have Fresenius. These are three cases that have been out there for some time. I think all of us were interested to see when they would be settled. But I guess the thing that's striking me, Mike, is that the information that's being presented to us, I think, really helps the compliance practitioner understand the bribery schemes that are used, but also is pointing towards greater certainty in the fine and penalty you'll sustain if you do make the difficult decision to self-disclose and go to try to obtain a declination under the new corporate enforcement policy.
Yeah, I think that I agree wholeheartedly, and I think we'll see an uptick, if we haven't already seen it, in terms of people taking advantage of self-disclosure. I just think they're creating more certainty around it, and the benefits are such that, the light touch on the corporation with, a focus on individual prosecution. It just seems like the more and more companies, I think, will take advantage of it. I don't think it'll be, overwhelming, but I do think at the margins we'll see more cooperation and self-disclosure.
I agree, Mike. Well, as always, it's been a fascinating exploration of a case that just literally came out last week. So we'll have to see what, as you said, what Q2 brings us. Thanks again, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. Sorry for the audio quality on this episode. Mike Volkov and I have both been running multi-part blog post series on the Fresenius FCPA enforcement action. Mike did a 3-part series last week, which you can check out on his site, Corruption, Crime, and Compliance. I'm running, looks like a 6-part series. I've really got carried away on this one because I think it's really important and really instructful for the compliance practitioner. So right now it's at 6 parts, but who knows where it'll go. It may even go longer than that. But anyway, we'll certainly give you a deep dive. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.